Welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving straight into the deep end of modern political theory today, looking closely at a 17th century thinker who completely revolutionized our understanding of power, authority, and society. Of course, I'm talking about Thomas Hobbes. If you've ever stopped to wonder why we actually have governments, or why we just agree to follow the rules, you're going to find his ideas absolutely fascinating. We're going to unpack his masterwork, explore the architecture of the modern state, and take a really close look at the brilliant and, frankly, somewhat terrifying logic that built it. All right, let's get into it. So, what if there were no laws, no police, and no government? To really get Hobbes, we have to start right there with a thought experiment. I want you to completely strip away everything you know about modern society. Imagine a world with absolutely no laws, no police, no courts, nothing. Every single person is completely free to do whatever they want, whenever they want to do it. Now, on the surface, that sounds like ultimate freedom, doesn't it? But really think about it for a second. If you have something someone else wants, food, shelter, basic resources, there is no authority out there to stop them from taking it from you. You're completely on your own. And that terrifying scenario, that's the baseline of Hobbes' entire philosophy. The thing is, Hobbes didn't just imagine this chaos. He lived through it. He was alive during the incredibly bloody English Civil War in the mid-17th century. He witnessed massive bloodshed, intense political instability, and even the execution of King Charles I in 1649. Looking at all this anarchy, Hobbes became deeply convinced of one core idea: disorder is humanity's absolute greatest threat, period. To him, a strong centralized authority wasn't just some nice political preference. It was literally a matter of life and death. And this intense belief is exactly what culminated in his most famous book, Leviathan, published in 1651.
Which brings us to Section 1, the state of nature, a war of all against all.
Hobbes used that term, the state of nature, to describe the lawless baseline we just talked about. And what's really fascinating here is that he argued that in nature, humans are basically equal in physical and mental strength. Now, usually we think equality is a great thing, right? But Hobbes says this equality is actually dangerous. Because if we're all relatively equal, it means anyone is capable of taking down anyone else. So why would we fight? He breaks it down into three rational drivers of violence. First, competition. Resources are limited, so we inevitably fight over goods. Second, diffidence, which basically just means mutual distrust or paranoia. Even if you don't want to attack your neighbor, you know they might attack you. So the most rational move, strike first. And third, glory. People will fight for reputation because looking tough might actually deter others from messing with you later on. Because of those three drivers, competition, diffidence, and glory, the state of nature devolves into a constant state of war. It's not that people are actively fighting every single second of the day, but the threat of violence is always hanging over you. The anxiety is just relentless. And that leads us to what is arguably the most famous quote in all of political philosophy. Hobbes wrote that in the state of nature, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It's an incredibly dramatic, high-stakes realization. Without society, life is sheer misery. To survive in this kind of nightmare, Hobbes says everyone possesses what he calls jus naturale, or the right of nature. This is the absolute freedom to do literally anything necessary to preserve your own life. In this state, there's no right or wrong. There's no justice or injustice. If you need to steal or use extreme violence just to survive the night, you have the natural right to do exactly that. It's an absolute and frankly terrifying kind of freedom. But here's the catch. Humans aren't rational creatures. We don't actually want to live in constant, paralyzing fear. So Hobbes introduces a totally contrasting concept, lex naturalis, or the law of nature. So while the right of nature lets you do anything, the law of nature is a logical rule discovered by human reason. It tells you that you shouldn't do things that destroy your own life. And because of that, the primary, most fundamental rule is to seek peace. Our own rational minds tell us that to survive, we have to find a way out of this chaotic state of war. That logical leap takes us to Section 2, the social contract, escaping the state of nature. To actually achieve that peace our minds are craving, humans have to make a really radical agreement. We have to figure out a way to disarm everyone at the exact same time, so we aren't terrified of each other anymore. So, we surrender all those terrifying natural rights and hand them over to a third party to maintain the peace. But here is an absolutely vital nuance. This contract is an agreement among the citizens themselves. It is not between the citizens and the ruler. We basically look at each other and say, I'll give up my right to use violence against you if you give up your right to use violence against me, And we both give all our power to this ruler. And because the ruler isn't part of the actual contract, the ruler is not bound by its rules. And this brings us to the creation of the Leviathan. This is Hobbes' famous metaphor for the state. Let's look at what this new entity actually looks like. It's an artificial person, a massive, unstoppable entity made up of the collective power of all the citizens. It wields absolute power. Its authority is indivisible, meaning you can't divide power between different branches of government, because doing that would just create more conflict. The Leviathan is the source of all law, but again, because it didn't sign the contract, it is not subject to the law. It sits totally above it, strictly to enforce the peace. Now, I know what you might be thinking. This just sounds like a dictator. But Hobbes pioneered a really sophisticated logic to justify this, which is called authorization theory. He argues that citizens don't just surrender their power, they actually authorize the sovereign. So the citizens are the authors of the power, and the sovereign is simply the actor executing their collective will for safety. Under this logic, every single action the Leviathan takes is technically an action authorized by you, the citizen. The ruler's extreme power is simply an extension of the people's own will to stay alive.
Moving on to Section 3. Liberty of subjects. Limits on the Leviathan.
Does all this mean citizens have zero rights left? Actually, no. Hobbes wasn't just a blind cheerleader for tyranny. Because the entire system is built on human rationality and the desire to survive, there are actual limits to what this absolute power can do to you. His whole model rests on a really simple formula. Protection begets obedience. You only obey the state because the state protects you. Therefore, the one right you can absolutely never surrender is the right to self-preservation. Even against the almighty Leviathan, you retain the liberty of subjects. The sovereign cannot force you to harm yourself, kill yourself, or even testify against yourself. If the state tries to kill you, your biological instinct to survive completely overrides the social contract, and you have every natural right to fight back. So, what happens if the Leviathan fails to protect you? What if the state gets too weak and society starts sliding back into a civil war? Hobbes' answer here is crystal clear. The very moment the state fails to provide security, your obligation to obey instantly evaporates. The contract is totally void. You're thrown right back into the state of nature, and you are completely free to authorize a brand new Leviathan to protect you. All right, let's step back and look at Section 4, Critiques and Legacy, Analyzing the Absolute State. While Hobbes undeniably laid the foundation for modern political science, mostly by replacing divine right with human consent, his conclusions have faced some intense pushback. The most immediate critique came from the liberal tradition, especially from John Locke. Where Hobbes saw human nature as deeply warlike, requiring a total surrender of rights to an absolute power, Locke viewed the state of nature as mostly peaceful, even if it was insecure. So, Locke argued for a limited government with only delegated powers. To liberal critics, Hobbes' idea of trading the dangers of nature for an all-powerful dictator is just a massive, dangerous gamble. It's basically jumping out of the frying pan and straight into the fire. And the critiques definitely extend well beyond the liberal view. Let's look at this impartially through a few other analytical lenses. The Marxist critique argues that Hobbes' idea of equal individuals just masks real-world class divisions, and that this supposedly neutral Leviathan is really just a tool to legitimize existing property relations. Then you have the feminist critique, which correctly points out that Hobbes' model of the isolated warring individual is heavily male-centric. It completely ignores the reality of family structures, caregiving, and community building that are inherent to human survival. And similarly, the communitarian critique challenges Hobbes' starting point entirely. They argue that humans are never just isolated atoms. We are born into social bonds, so his state of nature is historically and socially completely unrealistic. Now for our final section, Why This Matters Now, Hobbes in the 21st Century. You might be sitting there thinking, okay, this is a 17th century theory based on a totally hypothetical state of nature. Does it really matter today? Absolutely it does. We see modern Hobbesian dilemmas all the time. Think about fragile or failed states. When a central government collapses today, we often see a terrifying return to something very much like Hobbes' state of nature, where armed factions are fighting for basic survival. In global politics, the international arena itself operates a lot like a state of nature, with sovereign countries acting out of competition and mutual diffidence. And even domestically, whenever there's a crisis, we see debates over emergency government powers. When governments demand sweeping new surveillance laws or restrict individual liberties in the name of national security, they are using pure Hobbesian logic. They're arguing that protection requires obedience. Hobbes forces us to confront some of our darkest anxieties about human nature and asks us to define the ultimate price of peace. So, I want to leave you with a question to think about as we wrap up this explainer. Look at the world around you today. Look at the threats we face and the powers our governments hold. If you were stripped of all authority tomorrow, would you trade your absolute freedom for guaranteed security? How much liberty are you willing to sacrifice today just to keep the Leviathan standing? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning and keep learning.